This is my true story. I gave my life working in the cold, through storms and freezing winters, so my daughter could live in warmth and safety. I thought she would remember that sacrifice. I thought she would care for me when I grew old. But one night, after an argument, she pushed me outside and locked the door. She left me sitting in the freezing air, shivering, humiliated. That was the moment I decided everything would change. You won't believe what I did next. Before I begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. From the day my daughter was born, my entire life became about giving her what I never had. I was raised in poverty, in winters so cold that frost covered the windows from the inside and our breath hung in the air like smoke. I wore the same coat until it fell apart, patched again and again, and I worked with numb fingers just to survive. I promised myself that when I had a family, they would never suffer the same way. When she was little, I labored outside in freezing weather to make sure the house was always warm for her. I shoveled snow, chopped wood, and repaired broken pipes so that she would never feel the sting of cold nights. While I came home with frozen hands and aching bones, she sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, eating food I bought with the last of my wages. She never knew the sacrifices, because I never told her. I wanted her to believe life was safe and secure. When she needed new clothes, I went without. I wore the same worn shirts and old boots for years, while she wore warm coats and soft sweaters. If money was short, I skipped my own meals, but made sure her plate was full. I worked double shifts during blizzards, walking home through knee-deep snow because I could not afford a car, but I saved enough to buy her boots so her feet never touched the cold ground. Every winter, I reminded myself that her comfort mattered more than my pain. When she grew older, her needs grew bigger. School fees, books, activities, everything cost money, and I paid every bill. I never let her see how tired I was, or how many nights I went to bed hungry. I carried those burdens in silence, believing that my role as a father was to shield her from them. Later, when she reached college, I was already old and weary, but I still worked. I paid her tuition, bought her warm coats for the campus winters, and sent her money for rent. I lived on bread and soup, but she had everything she wanted. I believed education would give her a better life, and I wanted to be the reason she succeeded. When she married, I covered her wedding expenses, even though it drained my savings. I paid for the hall, the food, the decorations, even the heating in the church so everyone would be warm. I wore my old suit, the same one I had for decades, but I didn't care because all eyes were on her. For me, her happiness was my reward. After her marriage, when she and her husband moved into a home, I co-signed the loan. She did not have enough credit on her own, but my name carried weight. I trusted her, and I wanted her to feel stable. I even paid some of her bills when times were hard, including heating bills, because I knew the pain of cold winters and refused to let her face them. Every step of her life was built on the foundation of my sacrifices. She lived warm because I endured the cold. She lived in comfort because I accepted discomfort. She lived proud because I stayed humble. I always believed she would remember this. I thought one day, when I was old and fragile, she would return the warmth. I thought she would take my hand and say, "Father, you gave me everything. Now I will take care of you." That belief carried me through decades of suffering, through nights where I came home soaked and freezing, through mornings where I left before sunrise and returned after dark, through endless winters where my body ached but my heart stayed strong because of her. My daughter was my reason, my light, my hope. I saw family as my final shelter from the storms of life. I thought love and blood would always protect me in return. I never imagined that the same daughter I carried on my shoulders through the snow, the same child I tucked under blankets while I shivered, would one day be the one to throw me into the cold and lock the door behind me. The cruelty of that night when she locked me outside did not come suddenly. It had been growing for years, like frost spreading slowly across a window, at first thin and almost invisible, then thicker until no light could pass through. I noticed the early signs long before, but I chose to ignore them, convincing myself that she was stressed, tired, or simply in a bad mood. But the truth was, she had begun to change. The daughter I had once carried through storms, the girl I once wrapped in blankets to keep warm, started treating me as though I was nothing more than an inconvenience. The first cracks showed in small arguments about money. She would complain about the electricity bill being too high, even though I barely used any power. She snapped at me for keeping the thermostat a little higher because my old bones could not handle the cold. "Why do you always need it so hot in here?" she said once with annoyance, while she sat comfortably in modern clothes and drank hot coffee. She forgot that the only reason she ever had warmth in her life was because I worked in freezing conditions for decades to provide it. But to her, the warmth I needed now was a burden. She mocked me for being fragile, as if old age was a weakness instead of the natural cost of survival. She would laugh with her friends on the phone, saying things like, "My father can't even sit in a room without cranking the heat. He acts like he's freezing to death all the time." Those words cut me, but I kept quiet. I told myself it was just careless talk. Then she started counting how much I ate. At dinner, if I asked for an extra piece of bread, she would sigh and roll her eyes. "Do you really need that much?" she asked once, forgetting that I had skipped meals for years so she could have more. Every bite I took became an inconvenience in her eyes. Every light I switched on became an expense. Every sound I made became a disturbance. I started walking softer, eating less, keeping the rooms dark, trying to make myself invisible in the house I once paid for. She began treating me like my presence drained her life, as if she would be happier without me. The small things turned crueler over time. When the winter grew harsh, I asked her once if we could keep the heat running through the night. She looked at me coldly and said, "If you're cold, put on another sweater. Stop wasting money." I went to bed that night shivering under thin blankets, listening to the wind outside, remembering the winters I worked without gloves, my hands bleeding, to pay for her coats and boots. She forgot those days, or maybe she chose not to remember. To her, my old age was an embarrassment, my needs an irritation, my presence a weight. I kept hoping it was temporary. I thought maybe stress from bills, from her job, from her marriage was making her act out. I thought maybe she would realize one day and apologize. But instead of softening, she grew harder. She spoke to me with less patience, less care, less love. My advice was ignored, my stories dismissed, my sacrifices erased. The warmth I had once poured into her life was returned to me as coldness, sharper with each passing season. And though I endured it silently, deep down, I knew the day would come when her cruelty would no longer be hidden in small words, but shown openly for the world to see. The night it happened is carved into my memory like ice that never melts. It was an ordinary evening at first. We had dinner, though it was tense like most meals had become. I ate quietly, taking only a little, trying not to upset her, but even then she found fault. She said the way I chewed was annoying. She said I left crumbs on the table. Her words were sharp, but I stayed silent. I had learned that silence was safer than speaking. After the meal, an argument began. It was not over anything serious, just about how much food I had taken, how much the heating bill had risen, how I sat too close to the fire. She said I was wasting money and making her life harder. I tried to explain softly that I was old and the cold hurt my bones, but she didn't want to hear it. Her voice grew louder, her face full of anger, while I sat in my chair, shrinking smaller and smaller. Finally, she snapped. She told me I was a burden. She told me I was selfish for wanting comfort. Then, in a moment I never thought possible, she grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. I tried to resist, not with force, but with words. "Please," I said. "It's too cold outside." She ignored me. She opened the door, and the freezing wind rushed in, biting at my skin. She pushed me out onto the porch and slammed the door behind me. I stumbled, nearly falling, my frail body no match for her strength. I turned and knocked on the door with trembling hands. "Please," I begged. "Let me in. It's freezing. I'll be quiet. I'll sit in my room." My breath turned white in the air, curling like smoke as the frost surrounded me. I knocked again and again, my knuckles raw from the cold wood, but she did not open. I could hear her moving inside, but she ignored me. I sat down on the steps because my legs grew weak. The night was silent except for the sound of the wind and my teeth chattering. My thin jacket was no match for the winter air. My fingers stiffened, my body shivered uncontrollably, and every breath burned as if ice had filled my chest. I stared at the sky, dark and endless, and for the first time in my life, I felt smaller than nothing. My daughter, the one I worked for in countless winters, had left me outside to freeze like a stray animal. I thought of all the storms I endured, all the nights I came home soaked and frozen so she could sit in warmth, and now here I was, denied even a chair by the fire. Minutes turned to hours. My body shook violently, but I refused to cry because even in that moment of humiliation, I did not want her to hear my weakness. Neighbors walked by at one point, glancing at me with confusion. They whispered to each other but said nothing, only shaking their heads. I lowered my eyes in shame, feeling as though I was begging in front of strangers. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the frozen ground. I had faced poverty, hunger, back-breaking labor, but nothing compared to this humiliation, being locked out of my own family's warmth by the very child I had raised. My body could have given out that night. The cold could have taken me. And maybe part of me would have welcomed it, because the pain in my chest was heavier than the frost around me. But as I sat there, frozen and broken, another feeling slowly rose beneath the shivers. Not anger, not hatred, but a sharp, steady realization that this night had changed everything. The man who had given his life for his daughter was gone. The father who endured humiliation in silence was gone. In his place was something colder, harder, something that would not forgive. That night, on those frozen steps, my heartbreak turned into resolve. She thought she could throw me into the cold. She had no idea that I would take that cold and freeze her entire future with it. That night, sitting outside in the cold, was not just about freezing air biting at my skin. It was about the humiliation that sank into my bones deeper than the frost ever could. I had lived through poverty. I had endured long winters with no gloves, no firewood, and sometimes no roof strong enough to keep out the storm. But never in all my life had I felt humiliation like the kind my daughter gave me when she locked me outside. I was not a stranger begging at her door. I was her father, the man who once carried her on my shoulders through the snow so her little feet would stay warm. The man who once woke up in the middle of the night to check if her blanket had slipped off so she would not shiver. The man who worked in icy rain so she would have shoes and coats. Yet there I was, sitting on her porch like a forgotten object, while she sat inside warm, drinking tea, pretending she could not hear my knocks. That image alone crushed my dignity. What cut even deeper was that neighbors saw me. People walking by looked at me with pity and confusion. They whispered among themselves, probably wondering why an old man was sitting outside shaking like a beggar, left in the dark by his own family. I lowered my head because I could not meet their eyes. For the first time, I felt less than human. My daughter had turned me into a spectacle, a man stripped of his worth, a father reduced to nothing but shame in front of strangers. I remembered all the winters when I refused new coats for myself so she could have warm ones. I remembered my hands cracked and bleeding from chopping firewood so she would not have to feel what I was feeling that night. I remembered working extra shifts just to keep the heat running in our old house so she would never wake up to frozen air. I gave her warmth every day of her life, and now she repaid me by throwing me into the cold like I was trash. My chest hurt more from the betrayal than from the freezing wind. My breath came out in weak clouds of white, and each time I exhaled I thought to myself, this is how my story ends, humiliated at the door of the child I gave everything to. But then, sitting there, I realized something. The humiliation was not mine to carry anymore. It was hers. By doing this to me, she had erased every trace of respect she might have had in the eyes of anyone who knew her. Neighbors might whisper about me sitting there, but they also saw what kind of daughter she truly was. She could lock her father outside, but she could never lock out the truth. And that truth would follow her forever. Still, in that moment, I felt destroyed. My dignity felt ripped apart. I was cold, hungry, shaking, and unwanted in the very house I had helped her secure. I thought of my wife, now gone, and wondered if she was watching from above, weeping at what her daughter had become. I wanted to disappear into the frost, but something inside me whispered that this was not the end. This was only the beginning of something else. That night on the porch, I came face to face with the humiliation of being treated as a burden, as a shame, as an old man with no worth. But instead of letting it break me forever, I let it change me. I decided my humiliation would not end on those steps. I decided my humiliation would be transformed into justice. If she wanted me to freeze outside, then I would freeze her entire future. If she wanted to erase my dignity, then I would erase her comfort, her credit, her name. She thought she was powerful that night when she turned the key and left me in the cold, but she had no idea that she had just handed me the reason to take everything back. That was the night humiliation planted the seed of ruthless revenge. While I sat outside that night, frozen and humiliated, my mind began to work in ways my daughter never expected. She thought she had broken me. She thought leaving me outside in the cold would crush me until I accepted whatever scraps of respect she decided to throw my way. But what she forgot, what she never realized, was that everything she had, the house she lived in, the heat that kept her warm, the bills that were paid on time, the cards she swiped in shops, the credit she flaunted, the comfort she bragged about, was not truly hers. It was mine. She had grown so used to comfort that she believed she had built it herself. She walked around as if she owned the world, but the truth was she had never stood on her own 2 feet. Every step she took was on the foundation I built. The house she claimed as hers was purchased with my savings and secured with my name. The mortgage only went through because I signed it. The utilities, even the heating bills she complained about, were under my authority. The credit she used to buy clothes and jewelry was tied to my accounts. She strutted proudly in her lifestyle, but she forgot that without me, it would all collapse. That night, while she sat warm inside, she thought she had power because she had the key to the door. She thought that by locking me out, she had control over me. But the real control had always been mine, hidden in the papers she never cared to read, in the signatures she ignored, in the accounts she assumed belonged to her. She had mocked me for being old, for being weak, for being fragile, but in her arrogance, she forgot the truth, that her life was still balanced on my shoulders. She did not realize that the same father she called a burden still had the legal power to strip her of everything. And that was her mistake. She forgot that access is not ownership. She forgot that using is not the same as controlling. She forgot that while she lived in warmth, it was me who paid for the heat. She forgot that while she mocked my patched clothes, it was me who signed the checks for her comfort. She forgot that her name on the accounts was only secondary, never final. She forgot that all the respect she thought came from money was borrowed respect, borrowed from me. And now, as I sat there freezing, I realized the truth she had forgotten was the key to my revenge. I would not shout. I would not beg. I would not knock on her door again. Instead, I would remind her, not with words, but with silence, that everything she believed was hers could vanish in an instant. That night was the turning point. The humiliation she gave me transformed into clarity. I saw her arrogance for what it truly was, an illusion. She believed she was above me, but without me, she was nothing. She forgot that the house was under my name. She forgot that the power company still listed me as the account holder. She forgot that the banks still recognized my signature above hers. She forgot that my will, my estate, my money, my decisions were still binding. She laughed at me as if I was powerless, but in truth, she had handed me the weapon to end her comfort the moment she locked that door. The truth she forgot became the truth I remembered, and that truth gave me power. I decided in that moment that I would use it. She left me to freeze in the cold, but I would freeze her entire future. She thought she erased my dignity, but I would erase her name. The morning after that freezing night, my body still ached, my hands were raw, and my breath carried the chill of humiliation, but my mind was sharper than ever. I woke up with only one thought. She believed she had power because she locked a door, but I would show her what real power looked like. My plan was not born from anger that would fade in hours. It was born from the cold silence I felt on those steps, a silence that carved resolve into my bones. I knew what I had to do, and I would do it slowly, carefully, legally, leaving no room for her to fight back. I began with my lawyer. I had known him for years. He handled my papers, my estate, my accounts. I called his office early in the morning, and when his assistant answered, I said firmly that it was urgent. Within hours, I was sitting in front of him with a folder of documents. He looked at me and asked if everything was all right. I told him the truth. My daughter had treated me as less than human, and now I wanted to make sure she would never hold power over me again. His eyes grew serious. He laid out the options, and I listened carefully. I told him to start by removing her name from every joint account. She had access, but I wanted her erased entirely. No signatures, no cards, no rights. I signed the forms with a steady hand, each stroke of the pen feeling like I was reclaiming a piece of my dignity. Next, we moved to property. The house she claimed as hers was still tied to my name. The mortgage existed only because of my backing. I told him I wanted full control transferred into a private trust. She would not be able to touch it, claim it, or sell it. He nodded and prepared the papers. Then we spoke about utilities. The heat, the electricity, the gas. Everything was still under my authority. I asked him to draft the documents to change account holders and remove her completely. I wanted her name gone from every record. I wanted her life to stand alone, unsupported, so she could finally see what she truly was without me. Nothing. When the legal side was done, I turned to my financial advisor. I told him to restructure my savings and investments, moving everything into accounts under my name only. No shared access, no joint control, just me. I instructed him to freeze her cards and cancel any credit lines tied to my information. He raised his eyebrows, but followed my orders without hesitation. He asked if I wanted this temporary or permanent. Permanent, I said without a pause. I also instructed him to redirect parts of my assets into charities and relatives who still respected me. If my money was going to help someone, it would not be her. He agreed and began the transfers. By the end of that meeting, my daughter's financial foundation was already crumbling, but I was not finished. I went home, sat in silence, and thought of every area of her life tied to me. Then I listed them one by one and cut them away. Heating bills? Gone. Credit lines? Canceled. Property access? Removed. Estate rights? Erased. I even instructed my lawyer to begin preparing eviction paperwork in case she tried to claim the house again. My plan was precise. Take away her security, her comfort, her pride, one piece at a time until all that was left was the same cold she had left me in. I did not shout. I did not confront her. I did not beg her to understand. I simply acted. My silence would be my revenge, my pen the weapon, my signatures the execution. She thought that locking me out in the cold proved her strength, but my plan would prove her weakness. My plan would freeze her entire future. A plan means nothing unless it is carried out, and I knew I could not wait long. My humiliation was still fresh, and my resolve was sharp. So, the very next day, I began the execution. I woke early, put on my old jacket, and carried the folder of documents with me. My daughter was still asleep, wrapped in warmth, unaware that by nightfall her comfort would begin to unravel. I walked out into the cold morning air. But this time, the cold did not feel like punishment. It felt like strength, a reminder of why I was doing this. The first stop was the bank. The manager had known me for many years, had seen my savings grow slowly from years of work, and he greeted me with respect. I handed him the documents prepared by my lawyer and said clearly, "Remove her name from everything, cancel her cards, freeze any account she has access to. Make it final." He looked at me with surprise, asked if I was certain, and I told him, "She locked me outside in the cold. Now I will lock her out of my life." He nodded, processed the forms, and one by one her ties were cut. Her cards, the ones she loved to swipe so carelessly, were canceled. Her access to accounts was gone. Her ability to move money, to use credit, to live with false confidence, erased in minutes. I signed the papers with a steady hand, and each signature felt like justice being written. From there, I walked to the office of my financial advisor. He was already informed of my request and had begun restructuring my assets. I sat with him as he finalized the transfers. He showed me screens where her name disappeared from accounts, where balances shifted into my private trust, where credit lines closed permanently. He asked me again if I wanted this undone later, if I wanted to leave her a chance. I shook my head. No chances. She made her choice when she turned the key and left me outside. He understood and continued. By midday, her financial identity tied to me was gone. But I did not stop there. I contacted the power company and the heating provider. With the authority of the account holder, I canceled her connections and set termination dates. Winter was here, and she would soon learn what it meant to live without heat. She had mocked me for being fragile, for needing warmth. Now she would sit in the same cold she once forced me into. When I hung up the phone, there was no guilt in my heart, only clarity. This was not cruelty. This was balance. I was not taking more than she gave. I was giving her exactly what she handed me that night on the porch: cold, silence, and disregard. In the afternoon, I went to my lawyer once more to sign eviction paperwork. The house she believed was hers had never belonged to her. It was under my authority, and I now wanted her name legally removed. My lawyer drafted the documents, and I signed them calmly. Within weeks, she would no longer have the right to stay. When I walked back home later that day, the weight I had carried for years felt lighter. She sat in the living room scrolling on her phone, laughing with her friends, still clueless about the storm I had unleashed. She had no idea her cards were already useless. She had no idea her accounts were frozen. She had no idea the heat she took for granted would be gone soon. I watched her and thought to myself, she believes she won because she locked one door. But I have just locked every door of her future. That was the execution. Not loud, not violent, not messy. Just quiet signatures, quiet calls, quiet papers filed, silent but final. She gave me a cold night. I gave her a frozen future. The fallout began sooner than even I expected. My daughter woke up the next morning as if nothing had changed. She stretched, made herself coffee, and picked out clothes for the day. She spoke on the phone with a friend about a shopping trip, laughing loudly, her voice filled with arrogance. She still believed the world was hers, still believed her comfort would last forever. She left the house with her purse, confident as always, and I sat silently in my chair, knowing that her pride was about to shatter. By noon, she came rushing back, her face pale, her steps fast, her voice shaking. She slammed the door and shouted for her husband. "My card was declined," she yelled. He frowned, confused, and told her to try another one. She pulled out a second card, opened her phone to check her balance, and when she tapped, the screen showed the same result: declined. She tried a third card, her fingers trembling now, and again: declined. Her husband asked what was happening, and she screamed at him, saying it must be a mistake. She grabbed the phone and called the bank, demanding answers, her tone sharp and impatient. But the calm voice on the other end told her the truth. The accounts had been closed. The access had been removed. She had no legal rights anymore. She shouted louder, accused the bank of error. but the representative repeated the same thing again and again. Your name is no longer attached. You are not authorized. She threw the phone across the room in rage, her face red, her hands shaking. Her husband stared at her, his patience already thin, and asked if she knew what this meant. She ignored him, dialing again, hoping another person would tell her something different. But no matter how many times she called, the answer was always the same. She had nothing. I sat in silence, watching from the corner, my old hands folded on my lap. She looked at me, her eyes wide, her face twisted with fury, and shouted, "Did you know about this? Did you do this?" I met her gaze but said nothing. My silence spoke louder than words. She stormed past me, pacing the room, muttering under her breath. Later that evening, creditors began calling. Bills she thought were handled now demanded payment. Her husband answered one call, and I heard his tone change from calm to angry. He looked at her with suspicion, then with disgust. Their argument started small, but grew quickly. He shouted at her, asking what she had done, how she could let this happen. She shouted back, blaming everyone but herself. Their voices echoed through the house while I sat in silence. That night, she went to bed restless, her pride crumbling, her comfort slipping through her hands. But the worst was yet to come. Days later, the winter bills arrived. She opened the envelope expecting the usual, but instead she saw a notice. The heating account had been terminated. She read it aloud in disbelief. Service discontinued due to account closure. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but when the furnace stopped working and the house grew cold, she realized it was real. She ran to the thermostat, twisting the dial, but nothing happened. She called the power company, yelling, crying, begging, but they told her plainly, "The account is no longer in your name. Service has ended." She collapsed onto the floor, her hands covering her face, tears streaming down. The same daughter who had locked me outside in the freezing night was now shivering in her own house, wrapped in blankets, powerless to stop the cold creeping in. Her children cried, asking why the house was so cold, and she had no answer. Her husband grew angrier, telling her she had ruined everything. They argued louder, their voices sharp, and I heard him say, "You've destroyed us." She looked at me again, her eyes full of rage, but also fear. She knew deep down I was behind it, but she could not prove it. She screamed at me, "You hate me! You want me to suffer!" But I stayed silent. My silence was heavier than her screams. Within a week, her credit was gone, her money was gone, her heat was gone, and the property notice arrived. A letter taped to the door stated that she no longer had rights to the house. She ripped it down, tore it into pieces, and fell to the floor sobbing. The children huddled together, frightened. The neighbors began to whisper. People who once admired her lifestyle now spoke about how quickly it had collapsed. She avoided them, too ashamed to meet their eyes. Relatives who once envied her comfort now shook their heads, saying, "She forgot who built her life." Even her friends stopped answering her calls. She sat alone in her cold house, wrapped in coats, staring at unpaid bills. The arrogance was gone. The pride was gone. All that remained was fear and shame. She had mocked me for being fragile, but now she was fragile. She had mocked me for being dependent, but now she was dependent on nothing but empty promises. She had mocked me for being weak, but now she was the weakest I had ever seen her. Watching her fall was not joyful. It was not celebration. It was balance. It was justice. She gave me a night in the cold, but I gave her a winter with no heat. She locked me out of one door, but I locked her out of every door she thought she had. She erased my dignity in front of neighbors, but I erased her future in front of the world. And through it all, I never raised my voice, never struck her, never begged. I simply acted in silence, and silence was enough to break her. The fallout was complete. She had nothing left. And for the first time in years, I felt warm again, not from fire or furnace, but from knowing that my dignity had been restored. The fallout had already stripped my daughter of her pride, her comfort, and her reputation. But I knew there had to be one final act that would seal everything forever. She had to receive something that would burn into her memory the way that cold night had burned into mine. I wanted her to look back on her life and realize that her cruelty had written her own downfall. Not by chance, not by mistake, but by my deliberate hand. The final blow would not come through shouting, or through more paperwork, or through public arguments. No, it would come in silence, with words as sharp as frost, delivered at the exact moment she thought she might still salvage something. That was when I asked my lawyer to prepare a short letter. Nothing complicated, no long explanations. I gave him the exact words I wanted written. They were simple, but final. You locked me out in the cold. Now, I've locked you out of my world. When I saw those words printed neatly on the paper, I felt something stir inside me. It was not joy, not satisfaction, but closure. I sealed the letter in an envelope and instructed my lawyer to deliver it to her once all the legal processes were complete, once the accounts were gone, the property transferred, the utilities cut, and her world fully collapsed. Weeks later, when she was already deep in panic, when her husband had nearly given up on her, when her children cried at night from the cold, that was when the letter arrived. She opened the door one morning to find the lawyer standing there with the envelope. She snatched it quickly, as if it might contain hope. Her hands shook as she tore it open, her eyes scanning the paper. She read the line once, then again, and then a third time. Her lips trembled, her knees grew weak, and she sat down on the cold floor clutching the letter. Her husband looked over her shoulder, read the words, and turned away in silence, shaking his head. The children asked what it was, but she could not answer. She just sat there, rocking slightly, whispering, "He took everything." Her voice was broken, thin, almost unrecognizable. That one sentence carried more weight than any speech I could have given her. It was the mirror she could not escape. It reminded her of the night she shoved me outside, of the key she turned in the lock, of my frail hands knocking on the door while she ignored me. Now she knew what it meant to be locked out, not of a house, but of a life. She tried to call me afterward, dialing my number again and again, but I had already changed everything. My phone was new, my address private, my world far away from hers. Her messages bounced back, her calls unanswered. I left her with nothing but that line, over and over in her mind. You locked me out in the cold. Now I've locked you out of my world. The silence after it was the real punishment. No reply, no negotiation, no second chance. She collapsed under the weight of that silence. Neighbors soon learned what the letter said, and whispers spread even further. Her humiliation was complete. People said she had ruined her own father, and now her father had ruined her. Friends turned their backs. Relatives stopped visiting. She was left to carry her shame alone. That was the final blow I had planned. Not just financial, not just material, but emotional. A truth so sharp it cut deeper than the cold ever could. A truth she could never escape, no matter how many blankets she wrapped around herself, no matter how many times she tried to forget. That truth would follow her forever. And I never had to raise my voice. I never had to explain. I never had to defend myself. One sentence was enough. She thought she ended me when she left me outside in the winter night. But with those words, I ended the illusion she lived in. Her world was gone, her future frozen, and there was no way back. That was the final blow. After the letter was delivered and the silence took hold, I finally felt something I had not felt in years. Peace. For the first time since that cold night on the porch, I could breathe without shame weighing on my chest. My daughter had taken everything I gave her and turned it into arrogance. She had mocked me, erased my dignity, and left me to freeze like I was nothing. But now, she was the one who had nothing. That was not cruelty. It was balance. That was not anger. It was justice. I moved quietly into a smaller home, one I purchased in my own name, away from her, away from the house where my humiliation happened. It was not large, but it was mine. The heating worked. The rooms were simple, but they were warm. I sat in my chair by the fire and drank tea, not bitter tea made in anger, but tea that tasted of freedom and dignity. Every sip reminded me that I had taken back control. I was no longer the old man sitting outside a locked door. I was the man who locked arrogance out of my life forever. Neighbors sometimes asked me where I had gone, why I left. I told them only this: I chose peace. They nodded, and in their eyes I saw respect, the kind my daughter never gave me. I spent my mornings walking by the river, breathing air that did not carry the sting of humiliation. I spent afternoons reading, something I had denied myself in my working years. And at night, I lay down, knowing I was not a burden to anyone, not a shadow in my own house, but a man who had faced betrayal and refused to die in silence. Meanwhile, my daughter's life remained in ruins. She lived in a cold house she could not pay for, with no credit, no comfort, no future. She tried to rebuild, but every door she knocked on was closed to her. Every bank refused her. Every relative turned away. She had mocked me in front of neighbors, and now the neighbors whispered about her downfall. She had laughed when she locked me in the cold, but now the cold lived with her every day. She could not escape it. She carried it in her bones, in her empty accounts, in her ruined reputation. And I carried none of it anymore. Some people might say I should have forgiven her, that she was my daughter, and blood should excuse everything. But forgiveness without respect is not forgiveness. It is surrender. And I had surrendered too much already. I gave her my youth, my strength, my health, my money, my dignity. When she locked that door, she ended the bond herself. I simply made sure she lived with the consequences. My justice was not in watching her suffer. My justice was in knowing I had restored my worth. She gave me the cold night. I gave her a frozen future. She tried to erase my dignity. I erased her comfort. She thought I was powerless. I showed her I was the only reason she had power at all. Now I live my final years quietly, not surrounded by wealth, but surrounded by something greater: respect for myself. I wear my old clothes, I drink my tea, I sit by the fire, and I feel no shame. I am not the embarrassment she called me. I am a man who endured, who fought back in silence, who turned humiliation into justice. My final thought is simple. She gave me the cold once, but I made sure she would live in it forever. And that, to me, is justice.